All right, we're in Revelation 16 this morning, Revelation 16. And we're going to look at the first 6 of the bowl judgments. So Revelation 6, and we're going to cover 6 out of 7 bowl judgments. So the bowl judgments, this is the third in a series of 3 judgments. And these judgments are as intriguing as they are sorrowful. I think the first reason that they're intriguing is because basically you just race right through these judgments. You almost have to step back and pause and remind yourself that these judgments will cover a 3.5-year period of time before the return of Christ. And I feel like I need to remind myself that because I don't know about you, but I can read through Revelation 16 and it makes it feel like these judgments are taking place over like a week and not over 3.5 years. So, and then after racing through these judgments, we really slow down for 2 chapters of mourning over the fall of Babylon. So just the space, the timing of this and the way, the pace of it is kind of interesting in the way that it happens. So what we want to make sure that we're not doing is we're not taking sort of a fanciful pleasure over these judgments that are happening. But at the same time, we're going to recognize that these are justice and they are righteousness that is coming from God. So let's walk through the final of God's judgments and his wrath, beginning in Revelation chapter 16, verse 1. Then I heard a loud voice from the temple saying to these 7 angels, "Go and pour out on the earth the 7 bowls of the wrath of God." So we have this loud voice in verse 1. Loud is the Greek word mega, which is just their word that means great. And there's a real emphasis on that word great. The word great or mega might be the most emphasized word in this verse. And so I'm going to say if you're going to be emphasizing the greatness of a voice, that voice is coming from the temple. This voice is none other than the voice of God himself. And this is to emphasize yet again the same emphasis we saw in chapter 15, which is whose judgments are these? These are the judgments from God. So God is the one sending the judgments, and God is not only sending the judgments, but what does God name these judgments? God names these judgments the 7 bowls of the wrath of God. So God is making clear with heavy emphasis once again that this is all coming from God. This is a result of God's righteousness and God's judgment. So let's keep that in mind as we're walking through this, that this is coming straight from God. And now let's cover the first of the bowl judgments in verse 2. So the first angel went and poured his bowl on the earth, and it became a loathsome and malignant sore on the people who had the mark of the beast and who worshipped his image. So again, notice the speed here. We have a single verse for this first judgment. It'll be the same for the second judgment, 1 verse as well. But while it goes by really fast, what's occurring here is just, it's a massive worldwide event. This is something that when it's over, if someone wrote on this single verse judgment, they would probably write multiple volumes of books on what happens in this one judgment. It's one of the reasons there were so many books in that Left Behind series, because if you want to talk about how all this might play out, it's going to take a long time to do it. I mean, just think about how we went through COVID. And, all the words that were spent going through that pandemic, and this will be far worse in my belief. And the insane thing about this is that God's going to take this judgment of the sores that are upon people, and he's going to reserve that for those who have taken the mark of the beast. Now, reading in commentaries, most scholars equate this judgment with bad ulcers. And it could be that, but I find it interesting that so often they want to go to ulcers because the word here that's used is just a very generic word for a wound or a sore. So it's just any type of wound that someone would have on their body. But the key to this wound is that it is called evil and burdensome. And so evil means the fact that it's going to be a great deal of pain. Like this is going to be, totally afflicting and dominating your life. And burdensome basically means the fact that it is just not going to go away. It's going to be a wound that's incredibly painful, and we just can't heal. And let me give you the Sean Wilson theory about this wound. The first bowl judgment will most likely take place, obviously, very early in the second half of the tribulation. And early in the second half of the tribulation will also be the time when people are getting the mark. So it won't be the time when people have had it for years. Based on the chronology of how it goes through, they're getting the mark at the beginning of the second half of the tribulation. So this first bowl judgment will take place at the same time that people are getting the mark on them. So my theory is that the reason that this wound is connected to the mark is that the mark itself will cause the sore that won't heal upon people. And I think part of the reason that this wound will be long-suffering and won't heal is because what you would need to do to get healed from it is you need to get the mark, whatever it is, out. You need to get the cause of that infection out. But if they're going to say you need to have this mark if you want to work and if you want to trade and if you want to go to the store and purchase things, people are going to be like, I'm just going to keep that mark even though it is causing this painful wound or infection or whatever upon my body. So my theory is that it is the mark itself that will be the cause of the first of these judgments as the two of them are attached together. So it won't be like God is, looking at all the peoples with marks and afflicting them, but something with getting the mark on, I think, will be what will cause this wound that is on those people. And if people all around the world are getting this mark in order to just be part of everyday business, working, employment, obviously this is going to be massive, really in a way that we've never experienced before. I mean, really bad pandemics, you're talking like 5 to 10% of the population, and obviously vast higher percentage will take the mark. So this will be pandemic type suffering, the likes of which we've never seen before. But my belief is it'll be the mark itself that causes the first of the bowl judgments. And then the second is going to go by just as fast, and that is in verse 3. The second angel poured out his bowl into the sea, and it became blood, like that of a dead man. And every living thing in the sea died. So this is the second time there is a judgment that comes and turns water into blood. This is the third time in human history that there will be a judgment that turns water into blood. We saw it before with a third of the waters in the world. Now it is all of the waters. This is talking about the seas, the large body of waters like our oceans. The Gulf of Mexico would probably fall under this category as well. And before it was a third of them, now it is all of them. The interesting thing, though, about the way that it's worded is that it's not the blood itself that is the focus, but it is the phrase, that of a dead man. That it is like a dead person blood is actually the focus upon that. So the focus is actually on the nature and consistency of this water turned into blood. And if you're talking about the blood of someone who has died, you're talking about a very thick and congealed type of consistency. So we're going to have water that's blood that's not going to make waves. It's not going to flow. Everything that's in the ocean and the gulfs are going to die of it. It's going to be like all of it becomes this slime or this muck. So that's really the focus on the way that it's wording is more on what the texture of it's going to be like than it actually being turned into blood. And everything that is in the oceans and the seas will die. So first and foremost, you would not want to be a commercial fisherman during the tribulation period. But this judgment, I think, is going to do two things to the planet at the same time. First, it's going to destroy a major source of food on the planet. Currently, right now, 17% of what people eat comes from these major bodies of water. So that's a major food source, 17% of what we eat. And then also, it's probably going to ruin sea travel. If all of a sudden water is at this, congealed muck consistency, you're probably not going to be able to move through it as you did before. So we will not be able to travel by sea, which that's a huge part of industry as well, and getting goods around the world. We use air travel mostly today for individuals, but sea travel is still so important. So it'll ruin that as well. So there'll just be a huge impact of devastation upon the economy when this happens, not to mention all the life that dies in the seas and in the ocean. So real devastating judgment. And then that brings us to the third judgment, which is important not only for the judgment itself, but I think the third judgment explains the reasoning behind the second and the third judgment both. Then the third angel poured out his bowl into the rivers and the springs of water, and they became blood. And I heard the angel of the waters saying, "Righteous are you who are and who were, O Holy One, because you judged these things. For they poured out the blood of saints and prophets, and you have given them blood to drink. They deserve it." And I heard the altar saying, "Yes, O Lord God the Almighty, true and righteous are your judgments." So this judgment covers a lot of things all at the same time. First and obviously most significant is the judgment itself. The judgment itself is that it ruins our planet's fresh water by turning it to blood. And if you know anything about people, what is one thing that all people need? We all need water. Animals need water. Plants need water. We all need it. And I'm sure they're going to have ways to purify the blood out of that water and to make it drinkable by things that they'll be able to do. But at the same time, if all of a sudden all of the fresh water becomes undrinkable and in some way needs to be purified, the initial impact of this is just going to be havoc and total devastation, an untold number of deaths. But there's a number of also purposes that we see for this judgment beyond that. I think one major purpose for this judgment is that this judgment is going to hasten the return of Jesus Christ. And what I mean by that is if all of a sudden the seas are turned to blood and then the fresh waters turn to blood, Jesus has got to come back soon because, you're not going to make it long with what's going on here. So to me, this is important to be like, hey, this is not going to last all that long. Jesus is going to have to come back and make things soon. So from one aspect, looking at this should allow the people who are living on earth, especially the believers, to say, Christ has got to be coming back soon. So it should build up an anticipation for the return of Christ in the midst of that judgment. The third purpose of this judgment is to highlight the justice that occurs in these judgments. So covering the second and third judgment, which are both about turning water into blood, they highlight the justice of all these judgments. And the way that we see that these are just is through the words of the angels. The angels tell us that God is righteous to turn the water into blood. And why is God righteous to turn the water into blood? It is because the world has been pouring out the blood of the saints and the prophets. And so in a righteous and just judgment, and similar to what do we do to someone who murders a dozen people? We execute them. It's justice upon what they do. And for spilling out the blood of God's saints and prophets, God is now going to turn their water into blood so that they might drink it. And thinking of these saints and prophets with the way that it's worded as saints and prophets, I believe that this is looking toward the spilling of all of the righteous of God's people from the death of Abel at the hands of his brother Cain, up until the very last of God's children who are killed before the return of Jesus Christ. So I believe this is justice for all the martyrs, from the very first martyr who died at the hands of his brothers to the very last. This is being justice for all of those people who died on account of their faith. And then an interesting side note, we read here about the angel of waters. The angel of waters is not the angel who's pouring the judgment upon the waters. It's worded different enough to let us know that this is a different angel. But we also, in the book of Revelation, we've also seen the angel of fire. And that was in Revelation 14:18. Then another angel, the one who has power over fire, came out from the altar and he called out with a loud voice. So we have the angel of water and the angel of fire in the book of Revelation. And where that sort of becomes interesting is that in the book of Enoch, which if I had to categorize the book of Enoch in any category of literature from God's people, I would call the book of Enoch Jewish fan fiction. It's similar to me to the Left Behind series. It's somebody who took biblical material and said, let's let's imagine what all the other details are in that story. And so they just wrote a longer narrative of what happened during Noah's time, the life of Enoch, in that time period. So there's nothing wrong with the book of Enoch. It's, to me, yes, very similar to the Left Behind series and what it is. But the interesting thing is that the book of Enoch does reveal to us some Jewish beliefs that were common during that time period, but we don't have in our Bibles. And one common Jewish belief was that the angels have control over various elements of nature. So there's angels who are over the wind, angels who are over the water, angels who are over the fire, as in the fact that God is having angels sort of govern the planet that he has made. And so I think what we're seeing here in Revelation is that that is one truth in the book of Enoch that is true. The Jews had that right. Maybe God delivered it to them in some message that's not included in the Word of God. But I believe here we have pointing to the fact that there are angels who are involved over the physical elements of our creation. And so we see this with the water angel and the fire angel in the book of Revelation. But that's just a side note. Finally, though, on this last judgment, it also serves as consolation for the saints in heaven whose blood was spilled on the earth. So not only is it justice and righteousness for them, but it also serves as consolation. Because we read about the altar of incense speaking in verse 7, and I don't believe in any way that that's the altar itself who is speaking, but we read earlier in Revelation who is underneath that altar in heaven. Underneath the altar is the martyred saints, those who have had their blood spilt. And so we should take this voice as their voice based upon earlier in Revelation. So the saints of God, what they're doing is they're thanking God for this judgment because he is bringing righteousness on their behalf. So they're thanking God that he is finally bringing the righteousness that they deserve for the fact that they have died on account of their faith. So we're 3 judgments into the bowl judgments, and I think occasionally you just need to step back with these judgments and remind ourselves how desperate the world would be at this point. I mean, imagine all these people are getting these marks on them that they feel like they need to have in order to be part of the economy and business, but these marks are making them sick. They're making them terribly sore and have these wounds that are festering in their body. And then on top of that, you have the seas turning into blood, the rivers turning into blood. I mean, this is just absolute terrible state, and we still have 4 more judgments to go. And in that context, that brings us to the 4th judgment in verses 8 and 9. The 4th angel poured out his bowl upon the sun, and it was given to scorch men with fire. Men were scorched with fierce heat. And they blasphemed the name of God who has the power over these plagues, and they did not repent so as to give him glory. So something in this plague, something's going to happen to the sun. Something will occur with the sun that scorches or burns men with fire. The word scorch that you used here is just simply the word that's used to burn up. And the one other time that it's used in the New Testament is probably actually the ideal illustration for what's going to happen here. The only other time this word scorch is used in the Bible is used in one of Jesus' parables. In the parable of the 4 soils, they talk about the plant that was planted on the rocky ground. It couldn't get roots in the ground, and the sun beat down upon it and scorched the plant. It burned it up. And so how will people feel during this judgment? They will feel like weeds that are exposed to the sun and being burnt up by the fierce heat that is on top of them. In verse 9, you have a Hebrewism that I'd like to just bring out. It says, men were scorched with fierce heat. It's actually written in the way that the Hebrews would write it, which is scorching them, they were scorched, which is a way to say that they were thoroughly burned. And God, times things the way that God does. So, it's interesting that he does this. But I don't think we always appreciate it when we don't have them, how bad sunburns are. Like sunburns, if you get a bad one, are awful. And God times these things because I started teaching PE for the homeschool class, for our local homeschoolers. I've been doing it for 2 weeks now, and it's just 2 hours once a week. Right in the middle of the afternoon, though. So, of course, on Thursday, I was out from 11 to 1, and I was very diligent to put sunscreen on week 1. Week 2, when I taught PE, I did not put sunscreen on. And the back of my neck was just burnt. And for 2 days, I mean, I was cold and I could just feel heat just radiating out of my neck. It just hurt all the time. And I don't think we appreciate how agonizing it would be if the sun is just burning people with terrible sunburns all the time when they go outside. It would be a miserable and terrible curse to have upon yourselves. And I think that's really all this judgment needs to do in order to be awful. And then also thinking about how one piles on top of the other. Imagine, though, in this context, just think about how the third judgment ruins running water. Fresh running water is now blood. And then the fourth judgment is our skin is burned up. What would you want to have easily when your skin's being burned up? You would want fresh running water. But now that fresh running water is been turned into blood. These are piling one on top of the other. And that's one of the things that we need to remember to keep seeing as we go through these, to see the gravity of these judgments. The world is literally breaking down through all of these. But then there's a real transition after verse 9. Because through verse 9, they have all been focused on the entire world. There's been a very global focus on these judgments. But then starting with the fifth, they're going to get very pointed in who they are afflicting. So look at verses 10 and 11. Then the fifth angel poured out his bowl on the throne of the beast, and his kingdom became darkened. And they gnawed their tongues because of pain. And they blasphemed the God of heaven because of their pains and their sores. And they did not repent of their deeds. So while the first four were universal, the fifth bowl is directed at the throne of the beast. And the word throne means that it is the center of the beast's authority, the center of his power and reign over the earth. And I also believe when it says his kingdom became darkened is not a way to be like, you know, all of a sudden we had 100 straight days of overcast skies and it was really dark all the time. Although growing up in Binghamton, New York, one of the cloudiest places in the world, I can tell you it's a depressing state to be in with 100 straight days of overcast. It's not fun. But I don't believe this is talking about the look of the sky at all, because I believe the sentences that follow define what it means that his kingdom became darkened. It didn't become darkened as in the skies itself were darkened, but I believe God dampened and darkened his ability to reign and rule upon the earth. In some ways, what I think we see happening here is a grace and a mercy for the rule, for the earth, for those who are living under the beast. This is showing us that the rule of the beast will not go unchecked, but that God will judge the beast in the midst of his rule. He will judge him for his sin and his rottenness and for how he has been reigning upon the earth. And I believe what we're going to have here is pain, just an unbelievably level of pain afflicted upon the central figures in the beast's government that inhibit their ability to continue to rule and reign, which will be a grace for all those who are underneath their authority. So what we see here is that they have pains and sores, it says here. And the word pains and sores, like the word wound we saw earlier, these words are also as generic as you can get. Like, it's the word for any type of pain. The word sore could be any type of wound that a person could have. So there's no details at all about what type of wound, any specific points to what kind of pain is. The only thing that we see here about the pain and the wound is that it is so bad that they will gnaw their tongues because of the pain. Now, I don't know about you, but I've had those times in my life where something hurts so bad, I can't keep it in. Like, it hurts so bad that I got to just, get it out and shout, try to release that pain somehow audibly through my mouth, through my voice. And what we're going to see here is a wounds and pains on the leaders of the beast kingdom that is so bad that they have to be audibly grunting and trying to release that pain from their voice. And if you're afflicted by that much pain, you're not going to be able to govern very effectively. And so I believe the whole point of this is for God to, really put a needle in the government of the beast when he's at his highest height, to be like, you are not just going to get a carte blanche to do whatever you want. Even in the midst of this, God is going to judge them. So I see the fifth bowl judgment as really interesting, because I think it's doing two things at once. And that is, one, it is a direct judgment upon the beast itself, but then also it is a grace and mercy for the people that are on the earth that are under the beast's rule and his reign. So hopefully the gospel will go forth in the midst of this time. But then we have what I think is one of the sad parts of this chapter, and that is we read that they blasphemed the God of heaven. And what I think is really sad about that it specifically says they blaspheme the God of heaven, is that the beast, his false prophet, the second beast, they're going to know explicitly where this judgment's coming from. They're going to be able to point and say this judgment is caused by God. They're going to know that they're in the midst of spiritual warfare. They're going to recognize the source. So what does that mean? That means in that moment, they could seek mercy. They could turn to God. But instead, they reject God. They blaspheme God. They belittle, they mock him, they hate his name. So instead of turning from their wickedness, they double down on what they have been doing and continue in their hatred of the Lord. So to me, I see a tinge of tragedy here, that even to God's great enemy in the beast, the Antichrist, the false prophet, even to them, God is giving them judgments to say, you see who God is. Like, you see who's got rule over this. You can turn from what's going on, and he refuses to. Pharaoh had the same opportunities early on with the judgments, but continued to harden his own heart until it got to the point where God's like, all right, then I'm just hardening you the rest of the way, and I'm going to finish it off. And same exact type of things happening here with the beast. Now let's go to the sixth judgment in verses 12 through 16. The sixth angel poured out his bowl on the great river, the Euphrates, and its water was dried up, so that the way would be prepared for the kings from the east. And I saw coming out of the mouth of the dragon, and out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophets, 3 unclean spirits like frogs. For they are spirits of demons, performing signs, which go out to the kings of the whole world to gather them together for the war of the great day of God the Almighty. Behold, I am coming like a thief. Blessed is the one who stays awake and keeps his clothes, so that he will not walk about naked, and men will not see his shame. And they gathered them together to the place which in Hebrew is called Har Mageddon. So the sixth judgment, probably most surprising, if we would have taken a survey after the first 5 judgments and said, what would you guess the sixth judgment would be? No one would guess God's going to dry up the Euphrates River. That would not be where anyone would go. And I believe the drying up the Euphrates River is meant to do 2 things at once. It's supposed to be physical drying up of the river to allow for ease of transport by land into the land of Israel, but also it is symbolic to point to the nations of the world coming and descending upon Israel. In order to understand the significance of the drying up of the Euphrates River, one thing we first need to do is think like a first century Roman. This letter was written to first century Romans. What you see up on the screen is a map of the Roman Empire at the year 117 AD, so just about 20 years after the writing of Revelation. And the one thing about the Roman Empire is it was massive. It stretched to Britain to the north. It stretched out to India, the edges of India to the west. It was huge. And if you're living right in the middle of the Roman Empire, like the recipients of this letter were, you had a distinct way to view the world. And basically the way they viewed the world was everything that's in the red, everything that Rome is covered, that's the light. That's the area of peace. That's the area of prosperity. Even if the Romans were persecuting Christians, still what the Romans brought was a culture to the world. And so this was the world you knew. This was the world you understood. But while today, if we want to know about the world around us, we can just go onto YouTube. We can get an encyclopedia. We can read about the world around us. For them, the world outside of the Roman Empire, that was the great unknown. They didn't know anything about those people. They were the barbarians. They were, the cannibals for all that. Like, these were the great unknown people. And so there was sort of this view, though, for the people living in the Roman Empire at this time period, that the Euphrates River was kind of felt like a boundary to the eastern edge of the empire. That, like, we got the Euphrates, we got that taken care of, so that's sort of a kind of a boundary area for our country and our empire, and it's protected, and those scary barbarians aren't going to be able to come in here. But if writing in a Roman world context, you were to say, the beast who was located in Babylon, who is already far reaches of the Roman Empire in that sort of dark, unknown type lands, those foreign people. But if all of a sudden he was able to dry up the Euphrates River and pour in armies from the east down to Israel, it would be the idea of taking all of those unknown clans and people from all around the world and having them descend upon Israel. So it would be the closest picture that they could get physically to saying, we're going to have all of the people all around the world come and descend upon Israel, which I believe is exactly what's going to happen. And the way that you picture that is with the drying up of the Euphrates River. And the interesting thing is that once the Euphrates River is dried up, the Antichrist, Satan, the false prophet, they're going to take this as a sign. Oh, this is the time for us to gather together and to go up against the Lord and his people. So they're going to send their unclean spirits like frogs all across the world in order to have these signs, trick people into joining into their alliance and their coalition. And people from all around the world will descend upon Israel for the day of God, the Almighty's war. So they believe that when they all gather together, they will have the ability to go to war against God. And we read that the location of that war will be in Har-Megiddo. Now, normally when we say it today, we call it Armageddon. But Har-Megiddo is a location in northern Israel. It's located in what were the tribe of Manasseh. The reason the New American Standard Bible calls it Har-Megiddo, and the reason that I've been saying it that way, is that Megiddo is the place name, and Har is the word for hill. So it's saying this is a hill, plain area in the area of Megiddo. So it's saying that this is a specific spot in Megiddo. The interesting spot, thinking Old Testament-wise, when it comes to this spot, the hill land of Megiddo, is that we see this location in the book of Joshua. And this was the primary largest place in Israel where Joshua's like, the Canaanites are still located here. You guys got to drive them out. And the Israelites didn't drive the Canaanites out, and they continued to dwell in the land of Megiddo. And so it sort of comes full circle here, thinking back to Joshua, is that the Israelites couldn't drive the Canaanites out of Megiddo. And then in the end, where are the Gentiles going to congregate to go to war against Israel but Megiddo, that same exact spot where they weren't able to drive them out before. And so also, another, just tying all this together, biblically, it was Joshua and his generation that never drove out the Canaanites. But what's going to happen when the final Joshua comes? Jesus comes with his armies. He's going to come and drive them out of Megiddo. So I see a real parallel there to what happened in the time of Joshua occurring there. So to me, you miss just so much if you don't understand the location of that and how it's related to the Old Testament, and really showing that Jesus is the fulfillment of what should have happened with Joshua and the Israelites back in the Old Testament. So this is an important spot, an important location. There's one of the interesting things is that when you do those Bible land tours, a lot of places you can go to and be like, I don't really know if that's where they buried Jesus. Like, I don't really know if that's where that person was healed. Like, we're taking good guesses that things happen here, but we're not 100% sure. And one of those spots, though, that I believe we can be 100% sure on is that you can walk to the Valley of Megiddo and stand right there and be like, this is a spot. This is where this is going to happen. Like, we can know that right now and be, I think, 100% conclusive of where that location is going to be. The interesting thing is that it's a very beautiful valley. So it's a nice place to go and visit. So Vicky, if your tour group's going to take you to Megiddo at all, look forward to that. It's a nice spot, and you can know when you're standing here, this is where that last battle is actually going to take place. So this should be one of the places that goes on trips to Israel, because it's a location that we can say we know what's going to happen here, even if it hasn't happened. So specific place where there'll be that demonic war against our Lord. So the sixth judgment is really just God bringing the nations together so that Jesus can judge them at his return. But then we have what is probably the most interesting verse in this chapter, and that is verse 15. It's a parenthetical statement. I believe it was spoken by Jesus, and I think that's pretty exclusive view that Jesus is the one who speaks verse 15. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about what this statement is saying and what it means, because there's some people who say that this is related to the rapture because it has that I am a thief language. But I don't believe it's related to the rapture. I believe this particular time is related to the second coming of Christ and the formation of the beast's army. So what Jesus says in the middle of the beast's armies all coming together, Jesus says, I am coming like a thief. Blessed is the one who stays awake and keeps his clothes, so that he will not walk about naked, and men will not see his shame. So we're told here two real interesting things that kind of contradict each other. On the one hand, Jesus says, I'm coming like a thief. And then on the other hand, Jesus is saying, you should be able to expect my coming. You should be able to be blessed by being ready for my coming. Because the thing is about a thief coming, if a thief's going to come and break into your home, what is a thief banking on? A thief is banking on you not being ready for the thief showing up in your house. The thief shows up in your house. You could be in your pajamas. You could be naked in the shower, and you're not ready for the thief when he's coming. That's the whole point. That's the sort of main emphasis, that the thief is coming. And no thief, though, is going to go up to people before he comes to your house and be like, okay, I want to let you know, here's when I'm going to arrive at your house. On September 24th this month at 3 a.m., I'm going to show up at your house that day to break in and steal all of your belongings. A thief would never tell you that, because what would you do if you knew the intruder was going to come to your house that day? There's probably multiple things that you could do. If you're a cowardly person, you'd make sure you're not there at the time that the thief would show up. Or you could just be like, call 911 and be like, hey, some guy's going to break into my house in about an hour because he told me he was going to. Can you just have a police car parked outside for when that guy shows up? Or you could be like Rambo, and you know the guy's going to show up, and so you get all your weaponry out and you get your tactical gear all on, and you're like, Dirty Harry, make my day, But the thing is, you would do something to be ready for the thief. You would not be caught unaware. You would know when he's coming. And I believe what Jesus is doing here in Revelation 16, through these series of judgments, and then through this verse in verse 15, Jesus is saying to all the people who will be living in this time, I'm coming like a thief, but guess what? You know when I'm coming, and you can be ready and blessed for my coming. You can be prepared for the arrival of myself. You can be prepared for the arrival of Jesus Christ. You can be blessed for his coming instead of being cursed. You can be dressed in the garments of faith and righteousness in Jesus Christ instead of being caught unawares as a member of the beast's army. And so I see this verse as one of the other verses which, as we're walking through it this time, I think more than I think I've seen this any other before, I think one major theme of Revelation is that the gospel will continue to go forth until Jesus returns. I think that is a main emphasis of this verse, that up until the moment that Jesus' feet touch the ground, people can look to him and people can believe. Like that is Jesus. Jesus wants people throughout all the tribulation time to believe in him. That's why we have those great multitudes in heaven, because lots of people will believe in Jesus, be martyred for their faith. And so the point of verse 15, in my opinion, is that Jesus is saying, I am coming like a thief, but guess what? I'm telling you what's going to happen right before I come. I'm telling you all of the things in sequence that will arrive. So you know what? If you read this book, and if you see that in your lifetime all of these things can happen, what do you have the opportunity to do? Find the blessing. Clothe yourself in the righteousness of Christ and not be ashamed that it's coming. You have all of this opportunity to believe. So the book of Revelation itself is the world's greatest gospel track for this time period. Because this is Jesus saying, here's all the things for 7 years that are going to happen before I come back. And if you see those things happening, you know I'm coming. And you can get ready and you can believe. Even if you're one of those soldiers who joined up on the beast's army, or you were in the army of the United States of America, and they send troops over to join with the beast, and you're marching across the dried out Euphrates River, and if you're like, I feel like some weirdo at some point at some church talked about the Euphrates River being dried up, and it's crazy that this is happening right now, and I'm walking across it. Maybe what they said is true, and maybe I should believe in Jesus. That if they saw all of those events and believed in that moment, well, then they can be blessed and they can be ready for the return of Jesus Christ. So I think this gives us one of the purposes of Revelation, and that the purpose of this book is for those last and final days, for people to see all that is happening so that they might turn to Christ and believe. So the lost world, in the midst of their time of judgment before the return of Christ, they're going to have three major forms of witness during this time to turn them to Christ. They're first going to have the 144,000 Israelite witnesses. Second, they're going to have the great multitude that is martyred for their faith. And then third, they're going to have the book of Revelation, which will talk about all of these events that will prepare them for that moment when Christ will return so that they can put on the wonderful garments of Jesus Christ. And if you look at all of those together, it's very clear that Jesus, before he comes back, what else could he do to let the world know to turn to him? What else could he do? He was being as clear and as forthright with all of these witnesses, preparing all of the world for it. And if they reject it, the one person you can't blame for their rejection is Jesus, because he made it clear. Even when he came as a thief, he let them know when he was coming, so that they could be ready and put on the garments of his righteousness, which should be an encouragement to us to continue to spread that message today so that we can be those messengers in this time as we wait upon what's going to happen with Jesus at the end. But I just see a wonderful encouragement here that Jesus is calling on people to believe in him up until the pouring of the last bowl judgment.